Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. In the post-COVID era, we're trying to restart Malaysia, part of which we are still trying to grapple on returning back to the office. We are still keeping social distancing. We are still maintaining the hand sanitizer kind of behavior and all that. But one thing that is for sure is that a lot of PLCs, a lot of public listed companies are still trying to adhere and comply with the requirements from statutory bodies and the government. And this include holding annual general meetings or AGMs or EGMs, part of which is actually being carried out online and is being moderated by sometimes their own staff, sometimes people that are hired by them. This is something of an interesting observation that was made by the Minority Shareholders Watch Group, because they have noticed that there seems to be some kind of bias that is being carried out by the PLCs, and therefore they have issued a statement saying that these companies must appoint third party or unbiased moderators to actually allow for the voice of the minority shareholders to actually be heard in these kind of virtual general meetings. We've never been in this kind of situation before, and therefore it's always interesting to hear the developments of how we are grappling with the pre-COVID and post-COVID time. So joining me in this conversation is of course the CEO of the Minority Shareholders Watch Group, Mr. Devanesan Evanson. Mr. Devanesan, it's very interesting for you to accept my call and to actually have this conversation. Walk through us the kind of chronology of what has happened from earlier this year until now, to a point where you have to put out that statement that we saw yesterday.
Okay, what has happened is, under the current COVID pandemic environment, the PLCs are resorting to virtual AGMs by necessity. And going forward, there is a great possibility that many PLCs, even without such an environment, will adopt virtual AGMs. The idea with virtual AGMs is to try and replicate a physical AGM as far as possible. Now, one feature of a physical AGM is the ability of a shareholder to stand up and ask a question, address a question to the board. And the board is obliged to address that particular question. Now, that takes on a different form with virtual AGMs. So typically what happens in a virtual AGM is that a shareholder will type in a question during the AGM, and that question will go through a query box, and it will reach the broadcast site of the public listed company which is holding the AGM. That's when there's a moderator who sees through all these questions and maybe decides which question needs to be answered by the board and which does not need to be answered by the board. And therein lies the risk that certain sensitive, hard-hitting questions may be conveniently overlooked or not presented to the board to answer. Now, one solution to this is to make sure that all questions that are keyed in are in fact shown on the screen to all the other shareholders. So all the other shareholders can actually see what are the questions that are being asked. But that is a feature that some PLCs do not use. They prefer the moderation. And the problem with moderation is that sometimes some PLCs use your own staff to do the moderation. It could be the company secretary, either in-house or outsourced. And these are actually staff and contractors of the PLC. And that's why there's a risk that, the independence may be compromised. Our view from MSWG's point of view is that you should have an independent moderator to moderate these sessions, so that there's greater assurance to the minority shareholders that their questions are actually being considered fairly, impartially, and objectively by the independent moderator, and who forwards these questions to the board without fear or favor. That is the view of the Minority Shareholders Watch Group.
The thing about this is that there is no law that says they have to use a third party or an unbiased individual to moderate these kind of questions. How do you navigate this kind of issue when the law is silent on it? How do you impose this kind of call that MSWG is trying to make and make the PLCs comply with it?
MSWG is not a regulator, so we rely heavily upon our ability to persuade and influence. Those are the only tools that we have, persuasion and influence. So we like to appeal to the rationality and the morality of the issue. Independence is so important to ensure that all questions are answered. So yes, we don't have the law for this. There are no rules, there's no listing requirements, but it just seems fair to have an independent moderator to moderate questions from shareholders, because is that some questions may actually be overlooked.
Let's go through some of the instances where you would see these kind of behavior of moderating sensitive question or hard-hitting questions, and they are filtered and not asked to the board of the PLCs. Are there specific instances where that has happened, resulting in you issuing these kind of statements?
We have heard from minority shareholders that this does happen, but it actually happened to one of our corporate nominees who attended AGM virtually. The question or comment was not actually highlighted during the virtual AGM. But soon after the AGM, of course, there was a letter from the PLC to say that, it was not highlighted due to some problems, normally technical problems like buffering or, lagging or some kind of issue. The more important point is that it can happen. Risk management is all about the future, the possibility of it happening. And we need to assure shareholders that it will not happen in the future, or the risk is mitigated. So we have heard of such instances. It has happened to us, but our point of view is that it's not about what has happened. It's about the future, assuring minority shareholders that their questions will be considered and addressed by the board.
The statement that was sent out by MSWG yesterday was arguing that the virtual meetings must replicate as close to possible physical meetings. The thing about physical meeting is that you're there, you can impose yourself, you can put yourself, you can shout, you can stay silent but standing, you can do things, right? The thing about virtual is that you can't do these kind of things. How do you think this will work in terms of your call to get more transparency out there, but there's nothing much you can do other than press click and send the questions?
Yes, like I mentioned, that is the reality of a virtual AGM. It's different from the physical AGM. And you're right that during a physical AGM, you can insist on an answer. You can actually stand up on the floor and, take the mic and ask the questions. But that is missing in a virtual AGM.
I want to also ask, how do you think this will pan out throughout the year and perhaps even next year? Because social distancing is going to be a big thing. The government is still not allowing full-on normalcy. They are still allowing recovery MCO to take place. And because, again, it's necessity, there are still positive cases that we see every day in the teens, sometimes all the way to above 20 cases a day. Do you think this will go on for a very long time, this whole virtual AGMs or EGMs kind of thing?
Okay, I'll start off with some good news. The good news is that some PLCs have already adopted this concept of independent moderator. In fact, it's happening. And going forward, what we notice is that based on feedback, virtual AGMs are much cheaper than physical AGMs, especially for the bigger companies with a large turnout of shareholders. You save on the hotel cost, the food cost, and the rental of the premises and all that. So I reckon that, from MSWG's point of view, that going forward, there may be a preference for virtual AGMs by choice, actually. It is more, anyway, the Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance 2017 urges PLCs to leverage on technology for participation by shareholders. And this is a good example of leveraging technology during AGMs, the virtual AGMs.
I also want to talk about the path of MSWG moving forward. Do you think that you can assert your influence better in terms of trying to get your voice across? Because you do represent, in a way, my voice. People like me, right? Because I am a minority shareholder. There's hundreds of thousands of us. How do you intend to move forward and try to get our views across to the regulators, to the PLCs, and get yourselves a little bit more heard in the near term?
Three of our most important stakeholders are the minority shareholders first. The public listed companies are also stakeholders, and also the regulators, especially the Securities Commission Bursa Malaysia. So we are in regular engagement with the regulators. So we have an opportunity to use our persuasion and influence with all three stakeholders. The minority shareholders, for them to be more active in shareholder activism. The public listed companies to adopt what we feel could be a more fairer and objective approach. And perhaps more importantly, the regulators. We regularly provide feedback to the regulators. And hopefully our comments will persuade and shape future rules and guidelines.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Devanesan Evanson of MSWG. Remember, if you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com, look for Notepad over there. This issue has always been an interesting one to discuss, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.